In the last episode of this series, I talked about the appeal of professional wrestling, a form of entertainment that disguises itself as a sport. In this episode, I'm going to talk about NASCAR, a sport which tries to disguise itself as entertaining. Today, NASCAR's Monster Energy Cup Series tours around the country racing in front of mostly empty arenas as sponsorships and television ratings continue to wane. At least with professional wrestling, while not many fans enjoy it anymore, there's still at least a small nucleus of people that still care about it. It's nearly impossible to find anyone these days who actually cares about NASCAR.
Hold on, I'm gonna give my best NASCAR noise impression.
Most people, upon hearing the name NASCAR, immediately think of a dumb sport where dumb rednecks watch cars go around in circles. But I'm here to tell you that's wrong. The cars actually go around in ovals. In all seriousness though, it ain't easy being a NASCAR fan. It ain't easy having to constantly justify to people why you like something that's about as popular as licorice. There was once a time when many more people liked NASCAR, but that time has long since passed. The vacuous boredom often associated with the sport today has paradoxically created intrigue for reasons why anyone would even like it in the first place. Trying to convince anybody to actually care about NASCAR is a pretty tall order, but that won't stop me from trying. Because there's one driver in the sport's turbulent history that truly embodies all of the reasons why NASCAR was, at one time, the second most popular sport in America. This is the story of Dale Earnhardt.
I dream around and buried. I'm not where the sun will just explode. But God comes help me to his kingdom. They call you sons of bitches when I go. Let it blow, let it blow, let it blow, let it blow.
Many of my viewers like to draw comparisons between me and a writer by the name of John Boyes, and it's a pretty fair comparison, considering John Boyes is one of my biggest inspirations as a creator today. Last Halloween, John wrote a short story about a pitcher who sells his soul to Satan and falls away from the earth in the middle of a baseball game. While this story is clearly a work of fiction, it is eerily comparable to the real life and death of Dale Earnhardt. Our story begins in the rural American town of Kannapolis, North Carolina. Sometime in the late 1960s, a young Dale Earnhardt drops out of high school and uses what little money he has to start competing at locally sanctioned dirt track races. Earnhardt most likely shares the same lofty, unobtainable pipe dream as all of his competitors, to work his way up the ranks and eventually race in the top series of NASCAR. NASCAR, like Dale Earnhardt, had its origins in the rural American South. The roots of the sport can be traced back to the Prohibition era, where moonshiners, attempting to smuggle barrelfuls of illegal whiskey, would tune up their cars to be able to outrun police. When Prohibition ended in the 1930s, the smugglers were left with nothing to do but race each other. Small, unsanctioned races began to take place all across the South, but perhaps no other place became a more popular racing destination than Daytona Beach, Florida. The beaches of Daytona feature finely grained sand that forms a hard, compact surface ideal for auto racing. In the early 20th century, automotive engineers would use the beaches of Daytona to try to break the land speed record. Eventually, record attempts would migrate to the salt flats of Bonneville, Utah, leaving Daytona open for a new frontier of stock car racing. Stock car racing differs greatly from other racing series such as IndyCar or Formula One. These types of open-wheel racing feature expertly crafted machines specifically designed to maximize speed and handling. While open-wheel machines require an impressive degree of skill and finesse to operate, their design also leaves them very fragile, rendering them virtually unable to contact each other on the track, as even a slight tap can produce a scrapyard of wrecked race cars. Because of this, open-wheel racers rarely ever touch, resulting in very clean and fluid racing. Stock cars are pretty much the complete opposite. It essentially asks the question of, what would happen if you bought a car from the dealership and started racing it? Naturally, consumer-grade cars are much more bulky and less aerodynamically dependent than their open-wheel counterparts. This allows stock cars to take much more of a beating while still remaining competitive, leading to a style of racing that is slower but much more durable and contact-heavy. It's a style of racing that started to become wildly popular in the American South. And perhaps no other man was more responsible for the rise of American stock car racing than Bill France. Bill France was a fan of stock car racing since the days of his youth in the roaring 20s, where he would skip school to drive laps in his parents' Model T. When the Great Depression struck, Big Bill would flee to Daytona with less than $100 to his name, but he was able to stay afloat by racing cars on the beach. Eventually, Bill France would transition from race driver to race promoter, and on February 21, 1948, he revolutionized American motorsports by founding the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, NASCAR. Before NASCAR, stock car racing mostly featured scattered and disorganized events with inconsistent rules. With no major governing body to sanction races, there was nothing stopping some promoters from just not paying drivers the winnings they were owed. NASCAR changed all of this by organizing a unified schedule of racing events, complete with a singular rule set, championship point system, and guaranteed driver winnings. NASCAR truly became the first legitimate stock car racing league in America, and all of a sudden, the allure of earning fame and fortune through a life of racing began to attract drivers from far and wide. One of these drivers was a young Ralph Earnhardt, who in 1953 started racing full-time in NASCAR's Sportsman Series. Ralph Earnhardt's talent on quarter-mile dirt tracks made him a regional racing star in the Carolinas, and even won him the Sportsman Series championship in 1956. And even though he would use his racing talent to single-handedly lift himself out of poverty, he surprisingly didn't wish the same destiny upon his son, Dale Earnhardt. Both Ralph and Dale grew up in Kannapolis, North Carolina, a town so rural that it wasn't even incorporated until 1984. Before that, almost everyone born into this place had no way out. Only Ralph Earnhardt's racing talent could save him from a lifelong career at the local cotton mill. Dale Earnhardt saw his father as his greatest inspiration, and he saw racing as his only real ticket to success. Ralph Earnhardt didn't want his son to race, despite his own talent in the sport. Talent is a very rare thing. If everyone were talented, no one would be. Ralph Earnhardt probably knew this, and if he had his way, Dale Earnhardt would have quit racing to graduate high school and get a nice desk job in the big city. He probably never expected his son to become one of the greatest drivers ever. He never lived to see it either. Just 20 years after he began racing full-time, Ralph Earnhardt died of a heart attack. Dale Earnhardt could have followed his father's wishes, and if he did, he'd probably still be around today. But instead, he chose to follow in his father's footsteps. And in trying to prove to his late father that he belonged in a race car, Dale Earnhardt would accidentally become one of the best in the world. Just 6 years later, he found himself at the crossroads of history.
Covering a city block a second in rush hour traffic. Take a look at that. Earnhardt blazes back into the front of this group. Here's Earnhardt, your leader, out of turn 4.
Even at the very beginning of Dale Earnhardt's rookie season in the NASCAR Winston Cup Series, his talent was undeniable. For a moment, he found himself leading the 21st annual Daytona 500, which may have been the most important race in the history of NASCAR. Daytona International Speedway is quite possibly the greatest arena ever constructed by man. The scale of this place is difficult to describe, but let's just say it's big enough to be sunny on one end and stormy on the other. This modern-day Coliseum is the fruit of one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 20th century, conceived from the outrageous imagination of none other than Bill France. After 20 years of watching sloppy races on the beach, Bill France sought to construct a racetrack where drivers would never have to let off the throttle. The result was a 2.5-mile-long tri-oval surrounded by a 31-degree embankment. The sheer size of these corners is downright intimidating. It looks like you'd have a hard time walking up them, let alone driving on them. The mere architecture of this place boggles the mind today, so you could only imagine the amazement of the 42,000 spectators who witnessed the inaugural running of the Daytona 500. The pure spectacle of almost 60 stock cars barreling around an asphalt bowl at 135 miles per hour was something that no one had ever seen before. And after an unforgettable photo finish, the Daytona 500 immediately established itself as the most prestigious event on the NASCAR schedule. For every stock car driver in America, a win at Daytona is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. At the time of its opening in 1959, Daytona International Speedway was the largest track of its kind. 10 years later, Bill France would build an even bigger one in Talladega, Alabama. And while Talladega Superspeedway would also go on to be very popular with fans, it would not displace the Daytona 500 as NASCAR's crown jewel event. And that's why in 1979, CBS elected to broadcast the full race live in front of a national audience. It would be the first live broadcast of an entire 500-mile motorsports event in the history of American television. NASCAR found itself in a perfect storm of circumstances, quite literally, as on the day of the race, a blizzard left most of the eastern US stuck indoors with nothing to do but watch the Daytona 500. An estimated 15 million viewers tuned into this race, and for a brief moment, some of them got to see an unknown driver by the name of Dale Earnhardt leading the race. While his father dominated on short tracks, Dale Earnhardt would find his greatest success on the big ones, even though they would also provide him with his greatest turmoil. He didn't know it at the time, nor did anybody else watching, but Dale Earnhardt was cursed. This is the story of a person and a place, a racer's relationship with a racetrack. This was merely the first chapter of Dale versus Daytona. Earnhardt would go on to finish 8th out of 41 drivers in this race. Not bad for his very first attempt at NASCAR's most coveted prize. Dale Earnhardt's rookie effort would be reduced to an afterthought, however, as everyone's attention was instead drawn to perhaps the greatest finish in the history of NASCAR.
It's all come down to this. Out of turn 2, Donnie Allison in first. Where will Cale make his move? He comes to the inside. Donnie Allison throws the block. Cale hits him. He slides. Donnie Allison slides. They hit again. They drive into the turn. They're hitting the wall. They're head on the wall. Coming down. Richard Petty is now pulling out in front. Darrell Waltrip is in second. A.J. Boyd is in third. Here they come. Waltrip trying a slingshot. Petty is out in front at the line. Waltrip inside. Petty wins it. And here comes a $60,000 car becoming a 22-passenger school bus to bring his crew to victory lane. And there's a fight between Cale Yarborough and Donnie Allison. The tempers overflowing. They're angry. They know they have lost. And what a bitter defeat.
In just a matter of minutes, the television audience got to experience dramatic racing, a crash, an unforgettable last lap pass, NASCAR's most iconic driver setting an unbreakable record, and a bare-knuckle fistfight, all on live TV. All of a sudden, the colloquial regional sport of NASCAR found itself with a national audience. The finish made it all the way to the front page of the New York Times sports section, and NASCAR would never be the same. The 1979 season saw Dale Earnhardt capture his first career win in just his 16th start. He would win the Rookie of the Year award for that season and go on to finish 7th in the overall standings in a year where Richard Petty won his 7th and final Winston Cup championship. At this point in time, Richard Petty is unanimously regarded as the greatest driver in the history of the sport. Looking at it today, his career statistics seem almost mythical. Petty's 200 career victories are almost double the next driver on NASCAR's all-time win list, and his 7 series championships were, at the time, more than double any other driver. After the 1979 season, the mere notion of any other driver challenging Petty's throne as the greatest of all time was laughable, but if anyone were to do it, it would have to be a driver the likes of which no one had ever seen.
Where Dale Earnhardt in car number 2 is currently the leader, and he is on his way to victory and hopefully to pick up some additional points as he is on his way in his sophomore year to a national championship.
In 1980, Dale Earnhardt shocked everyone by winning the Winston Cup Series championship in just his second full-time season, only the 15th different driver to achieve the title of NASCAR champion. Already in his young career, Dale Earnhardt had joined some elite company, but he would soon learn that even when you're great, you're still a long way from the best. Although he began with one of the greatest starts to any career in NASCAR history, Earnhardt's car owner Rod Osterlund would unexpectedly sell his race team midway through the 1981 season. Earnhardt reacted poorly to this transition and struggled for the next few seasons while bouncing from owner to owner. After going winless in 1981, Dale Earnhardt had the worst statistical season of his career the following season, finishing the 1982 campaign with an abysmal average finish of 19th, while failing to finish more than half of his races for the year. After such a promising beginning, Earnhardt's Winston Cup career had slammed straight into a concrete wall.
I tell you, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. When you do that in a hot car...
Oh, we've got trouble in turn 1. Look at that, 2 automobiles. That's Dale Earnhardt in the Wrangler Jeans machine.
One of Earnhardt's 18 DNFs for the season resulted from a violent crash at Pocono that sent his number 15 Ford skidding on its roof down the embankment of the first corner. The accident would fracture his kneecap, but it wouldn't stop the scrappy Earnhardt from racing the very next week at Talladega, where he would suffer another hard crash. This was surely the most trying time of Earnhardt's racing career. Many at this time began to wonder whether Earnhardt's 1980 championship was just a fluke. But Dale Earnhardt was not like the other drivers. He wasn't racing for the fame or the fortune. He was racing to prove that he belonged. He was racing to prove himself to his late father, and when a man is dead set on accomplishing an impossible task, he will never stop chasing it. When faced with the lowest moment of his career, Dale Earnhardt did what he always did. He waited for an opportunity and pushed forward.
Fuck you, buddy.
Earnhardt going to turn 3 at 200 miles an hour. Winds it up, fires it in there. A brilliant maneuver by Earnhardt. The checkered flag belongs today to Dale Earnhardt.
Stock car racing's all-time winner, Richard Petty.
When you need a mower, go with the best. Go with Lowe's.
You'll be a winner at Lowe's.
Every weekend throughout America, there is great NASCAR racing.
I wouldn't be anywhere else.
Against sexual harassment.
Is this the best a man can get?
Sexual harassment.
Masculinity. Is this the best a man can get?
How dare you!
But something finally changed.
Yes, you're an idiot. You're an idiot. Okay, I'm fucking better than you. Okay, much better than you. You are garbage. I'm losing my mind tonight because of how stupid the majority of the country is.
Hey, we were watching that!
Join the club today and you'll see why 2019 won't be like 1984.
So that's the story of the 1984 Talladega 500. This man, Dale Earnhardt, is successful.
In 1984, Dale Earnhardt found himself with a new owner, Richard Childress, and a new car number, 3. He would stick with both of them for the rest of his career. Under Childress, Earnhardt's career would immediately begin to rebound, and it would mark the beginning of his finest era. By 1986, Earnhardt would be champion once more, becoming just the 11th driver in history to win multiple NASCAR championships. In 1987, he had the best statistical season of his career, finishing the year with 11 wins and his 3rd Cup championship. And after this dominant season, Earnhardt would return in black, embracing his new role as the Intimidator. Now would probably be a good time to explain what exactly made Dale Earnhardt such a potent racer. Well, Dale Earnhardt first learned his racing style from watching his father slide around on dirt tracks, and he never really unlearned it. Remember earlier how I mentioned that the durability of stock cars allows them to more easily bump into each other? Well, Dale Earnhardt would take this idea and turn his vehicle into a weapon. Earnhardt would make frequent use of the bump and run, a racing tactic where a driver uses the inertia of their own car to move other drivers out of the way and advance their position. It's a maneuver that's practically unheard of in open-wheel racing because it's really only possible in a series like NASCAR. Even within NASCAR, the bump and run is still a highly controversial move. Racing purists consider it a dirty tactic, as it detracts from the skill of outlining your competitors. Other fans view it as a valid and necessary part of stock car racing, considering it's a viable strategy that's not against the rules. Your outlook of this issue most likely determined whether or not you were a fan of Dale Earnhardt, as his frequent use of the bump and run quickly made him one of the most polarizing drivers in NASCAR, and his notoriety would only grow as he became one of the most dominant drivers in the sport. For many drivers, nothing was scarier than seeing Dale Earnhardt in your rearview mirror. If you saw the number 3 Chevy behind you, you would either get out of his way, or he would make you get out of his way. For many years, Earnhardt was NASCAR's greatest heel.
It's not fair, and they try to race nice and clean.
You know, the thing of it is, you go out and you run as hard as you can all day long, and then him trying to cut you out to outrun it, that ain't the way I was brought up racing.
I guess what they were insinuating, don't go run into Dale Earnhardt.
If you weren't an Earnhardt fan, it was probably very easy to hate him, because there was a good chance you could recall a time when he wrecked your favorite driver. Despite Earnhardt's tendency to enforce his will upon other drivers on the track, he certainly had his fair share of supporters. Dale Earnhardt raced in real life how anybody races the first time they pick up a NASCAR video game. The other drivers were just obstacles separating him from first place. Many fans found Earnhardt's cavalier style endearing and relatable. He would struggle and claw for every single position, much like how many fans in the poor American South had to struggle for every paycheck. Who cares if he bangs up some other cars, he's just trying to win like the rest of them. An uneducated small-town hick with no other prospects trying to turn lemons into lemonade. For anyone stuck in rural America, Earnhardt represented the way out. Standing outside of his car, Earnhardt was just like them. But as soon as he stepped inside that black number 3, he transformed into a racing god. A lot of Earnhardt's detractors pointed to his racing style as an unfair crutch, but eventually, for anyone watching long enough, his talent was undisputable.
And Earnhardt loses it, goes on the grass, comes back, and Earnhardt still got the lead. Incredible!
Although Dale Earnhardt remains one of the most memorable NASCAR drivers to this day, he was never the most popular driver. That distinction belonged to Bill Elliott.
You know, the thing of it is, I have been not the aggressive driver all my life. You know, I've tried to give and take with the best of the things. But when a guy cuts you off that bad and that obvious, it's time to take the other cheek.
Awesome Bill from Dawsonville, Georgia, was in many ways a foil to Dale Earnhardt. He, too, came from a racing family and rose to prominence in the 80s as one of NASCAR's best. The soft-spoken and humble Elliott contrasted heavily with the outspoken and brash Earnhardt. Whereas Earnhardt would gain notoriety for his combative racing style, the name of Elliott's game was speed. Over the past decade in NASCAR, the overall speeds of the race cars had gradually risen, especially on the giant superspeedways of Daytona and Talladega. In 1984, Cale Yarborough became the first stock car driver in history to set a 200-mile-per-hour qualifying lap at Daytona. The very next lap, he would lose control and total his race car. As the speeds crept upwards, the drivers crept ever closer to the edge of control. Despite the newfound risk, NASCAR's top speeds continued to climb. With each new superspeedway event, engineers and crews would roll out ever so faster cars. And from 1985 to 1987, no car was faster than Bill Elliott's red and white Ford Thunderbird. Perhaps his most stunning achievement came in the 1985 Winston 500, when Elliott cut an oil line and fell 2 laps behind the leaders, only to make up the entire deficit under green and win the race. His car was simply that much faster than the others.
In modern times, nobody has monopolized NASCAR racing like Bill Elliott. He has raced around this season faster than a person throwing double sixes.
2 years later at the same event, Bill Elliott would set NASCAR's all-time speed record, 212.8 miles per hour. For comparison, the pole speed for the Indianapolis 500 that same year, the fastest open wheel race, was 215. It's also important to note that, on average, a stock car weighs about twice as much as an Indy car. There's been a pretty big elephant in the room during this whole video. So far I've talked on and on about the history of NASCAR, but I've yet to explain why people actually like it. I mean, sure, it's easy to cherry pick the sport's most exciting moments, but what about the other 99% of the time is just regular old-fashioned racing? What's the appeal of watching cars go around in circles? Well, long story short, people don't watch NASCAR for the same reasons they watch other sports. You can pick up a football and start playing right now in your backyard. You can't just hop in a NASCAR and start racing people. In order to understand the appeal of NASCAR, we have to talk about soldiers, astronauts, and prestige. Being a soldier comes with a certain amount of prestige. Most people find their sacrifice admirable, but you don't have to search far to find people who disagree. You'd be hard-pressed, however, to find anyone who doubts the prestige of an astronaut. You can talk about intelligence and science degrees and technical skill all you want, but the fact of the matter is that soldiers fight against other soldiers in man-made wars, while astronauts fight against the surly bonds of nature itself. It takes bravery to volunteer yourself to go fight in some far-off foreign land, but it takes a whole nother level of bravery to strap yourself into a pressurized metal canister and fly out of the top of the sky. Astronauts have so much prestige because they come the closest to kissing the snarling jaws of certain death. There's no denying that war is also deadly, but humans have been fighting and killing each other since the dawn of man. It's easy to understand the nature of warfare. It's difficult to understand the limits of nature itself. And nothing is more terrifying than what we don't understand. Who am I kidding? This is a dumb analogy. NASCAR drivers are nothing like astronauts. I mean, come on. Have you ever seen a NASCAR fly? In the race immediately corresponding with Bill Elliott's record-breaking qualifying lap, Bobby Allison would blow a tire in the tri-oval. The back of his car would lift off the ground and sail into the catch fence at nearly 200 miles per hour. It turns out that if you spin a car sideways at a fast enough speed, the aerodynamics will force the car aloft like the wing of an airplane. In the 1987 Winston 500, the 210 mile per hour pace was enough to lift up Bobby Allison's 3,500 pound race car like a piece of paper. For a brief, surreal moment, all of NASCAR stood still. By pure chance, Allison's left front fender clipped the wall the instant before the back of his car hit the catch fence, which redirected the momentum of his car away from the spectators. Had Allison spun at just a slightly different angle, we could have witnessed a tragedy on the scale of the 1955 Le Mans disaster, where an out-of-control race car was projected into the stands at a very high speed. 83 spectators were killed in the catastrophe, leading many European nations to place a temporary ban on all motorsports. To this day, it remains the deadliest accident in racing history. Allison's car had sheared a 100-foot gap in the protective fencing, and NASCAR fans found themselves staring into an eerie window of what could have happened. Miraculously, only 5 spectators were injured, and no one was killed. The line between driver and spectator had been severed, and it could have ended NASCAR entirely. Fortunately, NASCAR would make good use of their second chance, as the era of speed came to a permanent end. This accident would force NASCAR to implement restrictor plates at all future superspeedway races, which would limit the horsepower of all cars to keep them below dangerous speeds. This would profoundly change the way drivers raced at Daytona and Talladega. Gone were the days of Bill Elliott making up 5 miles under green. Restrictor plates made it so that cars could no longer pull away from each other, instead emphasizing the attractive effects of slipstream. Simple racing moves such as passing were now drastically altered, as timing and aerodynamics were now much more important than speed and handling.
Restrictor ate it all up. It made everybody the same speed, and that made it probably more dangerous than when we were running 210.
Naturally, many drivers were unhappy with this new change, and no driver hated restrictor plate racing more than Dale Earnhardt.
As slow as all of us is running, there'd probably be trouble everywhere.
Which was a little odd, considering he was the best restrictor plate racer on the planet. It was one of the most dominant runs of any race category in motorsports history, and it happened during a time when NASCAR had arguably its toughest ever competition. The 90s truly were a golden age of NASCAR and popular culture. Attendance and television ratings steadily rose as movies like Days of Thunder drew intrigue from across the nation. Big brands and TV networks were lining up to capture their own slice of the booming NASCAR scene. NASCAR had gone fully national, and it had fundamentally transformed itself from a simple showcase of speed in the prior decade. The sponsors, drivers, tracks, and cars had all changed, but one thing remained the same. Dale Earnhardt was dominating the competition. From 1990 to 1994, Dale Earnhardt would win 4 more Cup championships, tying Richard Petty's record of 7, a record considered by many to be untouchable just 10 years prior. With each new championship, it became harder and harder for people to disregard Earnhardt's success. Although many still resented his racing style, you can't win 7 NASCAR championships without being a pretty talented driver. Earnhardt's detractors were simply running out of excuses to deny his greatness. Soon, there was only one thing keeping Dale out of the conversation for the greatest of all time.
Now, you've not won Daytona, right?
I've won Daytona, the firecracker race in July, but I haven't won the Daytona 500. That's like the Super Bowl race for us.
After 17 years of effort, the Daytona 500 belongs to Franklin, Tennessee's Darrell Waltrip. He's done it.
Oh, I won the Daytona 500! I won the Daytona 500!
In 1989, Darrell Waltrip won his first and only Daytona 500 in his 17th attempt. At the time, he was considered the best driver to never win it, and after he did, everyone was left to wonder about the next best driver to take Waltrip's place. Immediately, many thought of Dale Earnhardt, who had yet to win the Daytona 500 after 11 tries. But surely in 1990, while entering the final corner of the final lap in first place, after leading 3/4 of the race, Earnhardt could put the narrative to rest.
They still run single file, halfway down the back straightaway, half a lap to go. Still, Earnhardt now stretching his lead by another car length over Cope. The body can't do anything with Cope either. Earnhardt's car blows up! Earnhardt blows a tire in turn number 3!
And on the outside, it is car number 10, Derek Cope. Something amiss on the Earnhardt car. Coming to the line, it's Labonte pulling up, and an amazing finish.
Dale, what the heck happened on the last lap?
We run over some debris and cut a right rear tire down, David. Just a 1/4 of a lap away from victory.
In 1991, Earnhardt would damage his car after hitting a seagull, forcing him to pit. He would battle all the way back to second place before crashing with 2 laps to go.
Dale Earnhardt fails to win the Daytona 500 again.
In 1992, Earnhardt would get caught up in a crash that wasn't his fault. A newfound consequence of restrictor plate racing were massive crashes that would often wipe out over a dozen cars. After a while, these crashes seemed almost inevitable due to the extremely close pack racing that now resembled rush hour traffic, but at 190 miles per hour. One slight error by a single driver could spark a chain reaction that would take many cars out of the race. It was one of Earnhardt's main reasons for hating restrictor plate racing, and he would fall victim to it numerous times. In 1993, Earnhardt would once again lead most of the race, only to finish second after Dale Jarrett passed him on the final lap. After a 7th place finish in 94, Earnhardt would finish second again in 1995, and again in 1996. Later in the 96 season, Earnhardt would suffer a horrific looking crash that sent his number 3 Chevy tumbling down the Talladega front stretch.
Dale Earnhardt attempting to walk to the ambulance as he walks away from one of the worst incidents in his racing career.
While it was known that Dale Earnhardt hated restrictor plate racing, it was starting to look like restrictor plate racing hated him.
All those frustrating years for Earnhardt. So close, so many times when it should have been his, and it wasn't.
If we get the right help, we're at the right place at the right times. Like I just told Richard, I said, what do you think? You know him better than I do. He said, I've been here a lot of times before, and you can bet he's been in the floor pan right now with that throttle pedal, but if it's racing God's time to shine on that 3, we'll just have to see.
As was the formula at this point, Earnhardt ran up front all day and found himself in a battle for the lead with just a few laps to go. And all of a sudden, he found himself on his roof once again.
Oh, Jarrett's loose.
Down the back straightaway. Big trouble. Earnhardt out. Up and over number 3. And for the 19th time, Lady Luck deals a bad hand.
I'm not sure I actually believe in curses, but Dale Earnhardt's misfortune in the Daytona 500 really made me consider it. For some wicked reason, the 7-time NASCAR champion and best superspeedway racer in the world could not, for the life of him, win this one superspeedway race. Earnhardt's gut-wrenching futility at this one event is made even more insane when you consider that he's the winningest driver in the history of the track. No, seriously. By 1997, Earnhardt had won pretty much every stock car event at Daytona multiple times over, all except the one that mattered most. After 19 tries and 19 failures, he should have been completely discouraged. But Dale Earnhardt was not a quitting man. He wasn't even willing to quit this race.
What a pile of grit. Earnhardt is in the car. He's barking instructions to the crew. This thing is so beat up. If Earnhardt can make 1 lap or 2, it's an absolute miracle.
Even though he no longer had any chance of winning, Dale Earnhardt would hop out of the ambulance and back into his mangled car to finish the race. When faced with the lowest moment of his career, Dale Earnhardt did what he always did. He waited for an opportunity and pushed forward.
But Earnhardt has a benefit. There's a slow car up ahead.
And there's trouble coming off of turn 2. Some cars get tangled. It might be this. Whoever gets back to the start-finish line, they'll get the white and the yellow together.
20 years of trying, 20 years of frustration. Dale Earnhardt will come to the caution flag to win the Daytona 500. Finally, every man on every crew has come out to the edge of pit lane to congratulate the man who has dominated everything there is to win in this sport, except this race, until today. They used to boo Dale Earnhardt when he was winning too much. That'll happen if you dominate any sport. But today, when they introduced the Intimidator, the crowd was full of cheers.
For all them race fans and all them people have been saying, Dale, this is your year. Dale, this is your year. And boy, a lot of them said it this year. The Daytona 500 is ours. We've won it, we've won it, we've won it.
The hangover from Earnhardt's Daytona 500 victory lasted throughout the 1998 season, where Dale would not win another race and finish a distant 8th in points. Perhaps overcoming the single greatest foe in his racing career was a little demotivating. After winning the 500, Earnhardt had almost nothing left to accomplish. He could have tried for another championship, breaking the tie with Richard Petty, but both he and a lot of others began to tell that his age was starting to get the best of him. Later in the 98 season, Earnhardt suffered his second hard crash at Talladega in 2 years. In the post-race interview, Earnhardt for the first time ever sounded fed up, exhausted, and demoralized.
What was the day like up to that point?
Good. It's not good racing, though. Y'all can talk about all you want. It ain't good racing.
In 1999, Earnhardt would infamously dump Terry Labonte to win at Bristol.
Leader change and Labonte takes the lead. And meanwhile, Ricky Rudd's running. Oh, and Earnhardt spins him out. Dale Earnhardt takes the checkered flag.
Any goodwill he had from his crowning achievement just a year prior had worn out its welcome, as Earnhardt was showered in a chorus of boos from the 140,000 in attendance. At this point, Earnhardt and the fans had a mutual yearning for something new.
I'm here with Dale Earnhardt after he just won the Die Hard 500.
What's the question, dude?
How was the race?
Checkered flag, Dale Earnhardt Jr. is Texas Motor Speedway's second first-time Winston Cup winner.
While Dale Earnhardt never achieved his dream of racing alongside his father, he was able to race alongside his son. Dale Earnhardt Jr. made his full-time Winston Cup debut in 2000 under his father's own race team. Dale Jr. captured his first career win in just his 12th overall start, almost 21 years to the day of his father's first win. In victory lane that day, Dale Sr. appeared to take more pride in his son's accomplishment than any of his own. Racing with his son seemed to renew Dale Earnhardt's sense of purpose. Some would say that's all he ever really wanted, to race side by side with his own flesh and blood. And although the aging Earnhardt was nearing the end of his career, he would still make you think twice about questioning his greatness.
Earnhardt trying to come up through the middle.
Through a minefield of race cars at 190 miles an hour. And here comes Earnhardt. How did he get through all these cars? I don't understand how he did that. The Intimidator is scraped and beat on the right side. But he will not be denied. And Earnhardt is going for the lead. And listen to this crowd of 170,000 strong. Take his 10th career victory at Talladega.
Legend has it that Dale Earnhardt was so good at restrictor plate racing because he could see the air coming off of the other cars, and used this ability to perfectly time his passes. Dale Earnhardt's 76th and final career win came, fittingly, in a restrictor plate race at Talladega.
But take a look at this moment. That is Michael Waltrip, out of control, tri-oval, into a series of sidewinders. 9 shattering snap rolls.
Prior to the start of the 2001 season, DEI signed Michael Waltrip to drive the number 15 Chevy. Michael Waltrip had spent his entire career racing in the shadow of his older brother Darrell, and after 15 lackluster seasons, Michael Waltrip was still seeking his first career win. Dale Earnhardt believed in Michael, however, and he would open 2001 racing not just with his son, but with his team. I think all of you know what happens next. It was probably the only thing you knew about Dale Earnhardt. On one February afternoon, Dale Earnhardt would enter his black number 3 for the final time.
Daytona. Big one, gang. It's the big one. It's what we've all been fearing. This kind of racing is going to happen.
A horrible crash on the back straightaway that began when Tony Stewart got turned sideways against the backstretch wall number 20.
Boy, and it gets hit by every car in the field. Seems like, and Tony Stewart's car just took a whale of a ride. God help all of them because there's no place to go.
Incidentally, the crash would leave Dale Earnhardt in third position behind the DEI cars of Dale Jr. and Michael Waltrip. As the laps wound down, everyone began to realize that Dale Earnhardt wasn't trying to win the race. Rather, he was holding back the rest of the field so that his team could win instead. Dale managed to hold off everybody until the final corner of the final lap.
3 wide behind them.
You got him, Mikey. You got him, man. You got him.
Get him in the
3 cars out.
Oh! Big trouble!
The cameras cut away from the accident. It should have been one of the happiest moments in NASCAR history, as Darrell Waltrip joyfully commentated his brother's first win on the grandest stage of all. A storybook ending to a picturesque day of thrilling, action-packed racing. And then the cameras cut to Dale Earnhardt's crumpled vehicle lying at rest in the infield grass. Nobody knew it at the time, but the greatest tragedy in NASCAR history had just occurred. Dale Earnhardt, NASCAR's greatest driver, was dead at 49.
This is undoubtedly one of the toughest announcements that I've ever personally had to make. But after the accident in turn 4 at the end of the Daytona 500, we've lost Dale Earnhardt.
The official cause of death is listed as a basilar skull fracture sustained as a result of blunt force trauma. When Dale Earnhardt struck the turn 4 wall, he died instantly. Looking back on it all today, it's hard to believe it even happened. Dale Earnhardt was NASCAR's Iron Man, the toughest driver in the sport. He hadn't missed a race since his rookie season. He walked away from this, and this. Why did he die from this? How did no one die from this crash earlier in the race? Well, at over 190 miles per hour, destinies can be profoundly altered by a matter of inches. NASCAR's greatest tragedy was avoided by inches, and NASCAR's greatest tragedy was caused by inches. In the lap 173 crash, Dale Earnhardt was just inches away from getting collected. Ironically, if Earnhardt had just been a little less fortunate here, it's likely that he would still be alive today.
I remember him coming on there, and I can't remember if it was before or as soon as the wreck happened or during the red flag, but he said, "Richard, if they don't do something to these cars, it's going to end up killing somebody."
Dale Earnhardt was always aware of NASCAR's darkest secret. He just never imagined that he'd be the one reminding everyone of the truth. NASCAR is caked with the blood of dead drivers. The reason NASCAR was so compelling was because it was deadly. Obviously, no one actively wished death upon drivers, but it was mutually understood as an inherent risk of gliding around in a 3,500-pound hunk of metal at 190 miles per hour. Every few years or so, a driver would unexpectedly die in a race. Since the very beginning of the sport, this was the dark reality in the back of everyone's mind. You never wanted to see it happen, but when it did, you accepted it as inevitable and moved on. Dale's death was very different, though. Many racing fans still haven't moved on. It was just too painful. The biggest icon in racing dying in the middle of the biggest event. Imagine if Michael Jordan died during the NBA Finals, or if Tom Brady died during the Super Bowl. This is what it felt like watching Dale Earnhardt die in the Daytona 500, and in my humble opinion, it's the single worst tragedy in the history of American sports. Even though Dale Earnhardt's death was a devastating shock for the millions of fans watching, you could at least take solace in knowing that he probably wouldn't have wanted to go out any other way. Dale Earnhardt died doing what he loved, and his final memory was watching his own drivers speeding towards the finish line with nothing but open racetrack in front of them.
I think Dale Earnhardt is the best race driver that's ever been in a stock car. How do you feel about that?
Well, yeah, that's a big statement. I think my dad was the greatest when it comes to racers.
For as much as he accomplished, no one knew for sure if Dale ever felt he proved himself to his father. It's a burden he took to his grave, leaving us to wonder about Dale much in the same way Dale had to wonder about Ralph. The only thing we know for sure is that Dale finally caught up with his father's ghost. The story doesn't end here. Although NASCAR suffered perhaps its greatest ever loss, they still had 35 more races to run that season. When faced with their lowest moment, NASCAR had no other option but to push forward.
Park has the run off the high side. He clears the body, and Steve Park scores the second straight win for Earnhardt Incorporated and the second win of his career.
Boy, and that team, that company, Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, they needed that.
With an Earnhardt hat in his hand, Steve Park will drive to victory lane.
Just like a year ago, he's going to get him, though. He's going to get him. Gordon got loose in Harvick. Harvick by inches. A replay of a year ago with Dale Earnhardt and Bobby Labonte.
Look at Kevin Harvick as the fans saluted Dale with the number 3 on the third lap. Kevin Harvick salutes him on the way to victory lane.
If I was him, I'd run that thing out of gas riding around here.
What could be more fitting? What could be more special?
To the outside for the lead in turn 4. Dale Earnhardt Jr. rockets to the front at Daytona. Listen to the crowd.
And look at this crowd behind him. Look at this race behind him.
Here they come, turn 4, final lap of the Pepsi 400. Michael Waltrip in second, but it's going to be Dale Earnhardt Jr. using lessons learned from his father to go from 6th to 1st and score the victory in the Pepsi 400.
That's unbelievable.
Yes!
The man behind you did it, boys.
Yes.
You guys celebrate. Love you, man. You did it.
That was beautiful. Very, very nice. Junior, you're happy.
All right.
Look at that smile. Wow.
And with the most cathartic moment in NASCAR history, Dale Earnhardt Jr. would win at the track that took his father's life just 5 months earlier. For many fans, this win was enough to heal the wounds from the tragedy of that year's Daytona 500. Some fans thought this finish was literally too good to be true, and that NASCAR rigged it. A compelling theory until you consider the years of DEI restrictor plate dominance that followed. From 2001 through 2003, DEI carried the torch of Dale Earnhardt's restrictor plate prowess by winning 9 of the 12 superspeedway events. In 2004, Dale Jr. would achieve what took his father 20 years, by winning the Daytona 500 in just his 5th attempt.
The legacy continues. Dale Earnhardt Jr. wins the 46th Daytona 500.
Following the death of Dale Earnhardt, NASCAR would work to implement an unprecedented amount of driver safety improvements, most notably the Hans device, Safer Barrier, and Car of Tomorrow, to make sure that an accident like Dale Earnhardt's could never happen again.
Incredibly hard impact into the safer barrier.
Look at that safer barrier right there, how it just crushed all that stuff. Look at that. Look at that.
Goodness. And a wave to the fans.
My goodness.
And to this day, Dale Earnhardt still remains NASCAR's last fatality. Unfortunately, NASCAR's great strides in driver safety may be the only positive news for the sport in the past decade. Attendance, sponsorships, and television ratings have all drastically declined in the past 10 years, leaving the few remaining fans to wonder what exactly drove everyone away. Some people blame the recent mismanagement from Brian France and other NASCAR executives. Some people blame the chase and other gimmicks that have alienated NASCAR's core fan base. Some people blame the lack of interesting or relatable drivers. Some people blame the recession and how it hit NASCAR's core audience the hardest, preventing them from going to races. If you ask me, however, the main reason so many fans stopped watching NASCAR is, ironically, because it got safer. As morbid as it is to say, by removing the inherent risk of racing, NASCAR removed the one thing that separated them from all other sports. Today, NASCAR drivers have never been farther from the snarling jaws of certain death, and the sport has been made far less compelling as a result.
Not sure where Carl's going. Maybe he thinks if he runs across the start-finish line, it'll count.
That's what he's doing. That's what he's doing.
He's like a you know how he is. He's an athlete, a marathon runner. I want to finish the race.
And he did,
yes,
to a standing ovation from the crowd. Shades of Ricky Bobby.
Ever since that fateful day, NASCAR fans have been trying to fill the void that Dale Earnhardt left. There's the driver who carried on his name, Dale Earnhardt Jr. Following his father's passing, he became NASCAR's perennial most popular driver until his retirement in 2017. Although he finished with a respectable 26 career wins, Dale Jr. failed to capture a single championship and could never live up to his father's godlike legacy. There's the driver who carried on his car, Kevin Harvick, who was able to capture at least one championship and his own Daytona 500 victory. A successful career for sure, but not much compared to Earnhardt's. There's the driver who carried on his title as the 7-time champion, Jimmy Johnson, who in 2016 became the third ever driver to accomplish this feat. While he is statistically the best driver since Earnhardt, Johnson never managed to appeal to the fans in the same way, as his relatively bland demeanor failed to capture the hearts and minds of the greater audience. And then there's the driver who carried on Earnhardt's number. After the tragedy, Richard Childress retired the number from active competition for over a decade, but he brought it back in 2014 for the full-time Cup debut of his grandson, Austin Dillon. In 2015, at the finish of the July Daytona race, Dillon would suffer a gruesome-looking accident where his car was launched directly into the catch fence. For a brief moment, every fan watching tensed up in horror after witnessing what they thought was the second fatality in the 3-car at Daytona. Incredibly, Austin Dillon walked away from this with only minor injuries. Some have called him the luckiest driver in NASCAR today, but his luck hasn't contributed to much success on the track. So far, after 5 full-time seasons, Dillon has only 2 wins to his name. One of those wins came in the 2018 Daytona 500, as 20 years after Earnhardt's storybook victory, the 3-car returned to victory lane at Daytona.
And here it comes with the number 3 20 years ago. 20 years of trying for Earnhardt. He won the Daytona 500. Austin Dillon wins the 60th running of the Great American Race.
We're all searching for the next Dale Earnhardt, but we know deep down that he's irreplaceable. Many fans consider Earnhardt the greatest NASCAR driver of all time, possibly because we never got to see him decline. Dale Earnhardt remained one of the best drivers in the sport till the day he died, and even then, he still finished ahead of 30 other drivers. Everyone knows what it's like to be stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic, and all of us experience the same desire to break free from all the gridlock. Not just from the traffic, but from everything. Responsibilities, labor, authority. Sometimes there's no better feeling than seeing miles of open road in front of you. Dale Earnhardt gave this feeling to millions watching at home, and seeing Dale succeed made them believe they could too. For many, Dale Earnhardt was a real-life hero. But most people will never know his story. Most people only know him as some guy who died. They'll never know about the turmoil, the struggle, the determination, the notoriety, the heartbreak, or the triumph. They'll never care about any of it, because who could care about a bunch of cars going around in circles? NASCAR may never be popular again. Realistically, it probably should have never become popular in the first place. It's just a simple sport where no-name hillbillies gather to watch a bunch of fast cars race each other. But Dale Earnhardt made it mean more than that. And for as long as NASCAR sticks around, stock car racing fans will always remember the man in the black number 3, because there will never ever be another driver like him.
You got plenty of money. Don't need that to keep racing. Is it worth the risk to keep on going?
Sure, to win.